I'm here talking today to David Holmgren, co-originator of the permaculture movement.
Well,
It's such an honor to have you here in my home, David.
Oh, it's fantastic to be here, and after us communicating and connecting around various issues and activities over the years, and being aware of each other's work, to see you on home territory.
Yeah, well, I've seen your beautiful home, and so glad that you could be here today, especially in a time of COVID. We're very privileged to be able to sit here face to face.
Yes, well, it's been part of a 6-week extended tour away from home with our travelling bookshop and events, and to be in this Northern Rivers region for some events that are happening here at the moment before we head back home to Central Victoria.
I think it would be good to hear from you as the co-originator of sort of quick definition of permaculture.
Yeah, well, I suppose I should correct you slightly about being the co-originator of the concept with Bill Mollison, whereas acknowledging him as the father of the permaculture movement and the book Permaculture 1, which was published in 1978 when I was 23 years old. So, I mean, a lot of people think of permaculture as a cool form of organic gardening, or maybe alternative self-reliant living, but it's really a design system for both sustainable and regenerative and resilient land use, and also resilient regenerative living. So it's concerned with both the production side of the equation, how we get our basic material needs from a working relationship with nature, but also how we organise ourselves in everything from our households to a wider society, and the values and behaviours that come from that. So that idea of a design system, of design thinking, of course, that we can think of as coming from the design professions, architecture, landscape architecture, planning, but synthesizing that with the underlying principles of nature that we find through ecology, and having a primary focus, but not solely, on how humans provide the vast majority of their food through processes we call agriculture, which is still, the largest and most important and also most damaging activity on the planet. So a lot of people would say, yes, permaculture is a form of sustainable or regenerative agriculture, but in a lot of ways it's a more holistic integration that starts with that very basic relationship of food. And in the Australian context, I often admit that I'm probably a better ecological builder than I am ecological farmer. I've built 3 passive solar houses over the years. But I know in affluent countries and countries like Australia, we probably have enough houses and buildings. We just need to work out how to share them more. But we need to produce food every year.
Exactly.
At the end of the year, we need to do it all again.
Yeah. And it's something everybody needs every day. And that's why for us in the localization movement, we say that food needs to be at the center. And I'm pretty sure you would agree that as a holistic design system, you by definition will be looking at localization as a fundamental principle of permaculture.
Yes, well, the basis for that is not just a sort of a personal preference and a political view that it's actually better to do things at the smaller scale at which they make sense, and only move functions in society up to scales when they can't be done at that smallest scale. And clearly a lot of food production historically and still today can and is done at that small local scale. And the smaller scale is the household scale, largely in the non-monetary economy, and then moving out from that in local forms of production. But the view towards that is better for the environment, better for people, better for, in a political sense, of creating greater autonomy and power at the small scales rather than siphoning that power to the centre, is also underpinned by a deep ecological, energetic view of both human history, where things have become more globalised as the energy base of society has expanded, and the belief that with energy in decline from the fossil fuel era, relocalization in some form or another is inevitable. And it can happen in ways that are actually bad and badly designed, but the energy basis to support society, if that's lower, then inevitably things will be more localized because it's just more energetically efficient.
And what do you say then to the Green New Deal voices that are arguing that we can provide enough renewable energy to keep the global economy going? What do you say to them?
Well, I think it's a misjudgment, but I do accept that if that was the case and somehow, all the renewable technologies allow larger scale systems to flourish, then it's quite possible that those of us committed to the local, the small, will do so from a view of values and will continue that pathway, but it may actually represent some sort of minority resistance. Whereas if net energy available to society is actually peaking and going into a decline, then relocalization, the reconsolidation and simplification of many processes in society is unstoppable. What form that takes, of course, can be better or worse. So that sort of view of history is one that suggests humans have all sorts of creative possibilities and choices, but when you stand back, you see the environmental context in which cultures and civilizations arise does shape them and set boundaries to what is possible in the long term and what's not. So, you can take it from many different angles, but the other aspect about renewable energy is inevitably a renewable energy base is distributed. The sun is across the landscape, the wind is across the landscape, biomass energies are across the landscape. So globalization and the focus into urban systems, concentrated, has been fed by concentrated sources of energy out of holes in the ground. That's been this match. And as soon as your energy base is distributed, it actually, the self-organizing aspects in evolution suggest distributed economies. So even if that apparent renewable energy base is large, it will no longer be concentrated. And I think most of the people in the renewable energy field accept that.
Well, I'm not so sure that most of the players do, because remember, a lot of the players are actually petrochemical companies that have bought up the renewable energy companies.
Which will try and concentrate it as much as is possible, because their future is dependent on that concentration and control.
Yeah, but thank goodness there's so much movement from the bottom up, so that there is the hope that if people become aware of the sort of political issue of who's in charge and what the mainstream media and even the social media, what messages they distribute, and there's still this huge effort to urbanize the entire global population using renewable energy. And I think we also have to look at the fact that these renewable energy technologies are based on materials And there is a mining going on around the world that constitutes this huge cost, environmental cost and human cost, out of sight, that we need to bring into the forefront and acknowledge and look at, so that those of us who are concerned about equity and justice, we need to be arguing for that decentralized, localized model for these reasons of ethical reasons. And
There's the other aspect of recognizing working within those limits and not extracting another resource through regime change in more countries for our lovely electric cars or or whatever, and not just avoiding but refusing to participate in those sort of processes, is the acceptance that, especially for the maybe 2 billion middle class people on the planet, the opportunities to creatively downsize, change behaviour, do things differently, share our large houses, so many things where behaviour change is the low-hanging fruit. But often behaviour change is seen at a very simplistic level within the current consumer paradigm of changing the light bulbs. But when we realise the radical creative behaviour change, which can in fact live much more lightly on the planet, in the Western world, we can get 10 times more efficient and live a better life using less resources and energy.
And so much better life. One of the aspects that we need to consider in all of this is that in our evolution, we were living in intergenerational communities for like 23 hours of, say, our 24-hour existence, or more than that, 23 hours and 55 minutes of our existence. We lived in intergenerational community instead of being segregated and separated into tiny little nuclear families and cut off from each other, cut off from nature. So there's that other human longing for community and reconnection that is so visibly why the permaculture movement and the broader localization movement bring greater joy and happiness to people as they reconnect in more collaborative, ongoing, daily relationships. So I see in that way too, the permaculture movement has made a huge contribution in this, in that all around the world you can find examples of permaculture-inspired eco-villages and other localization initiatives where they're visibly demonstrating that they're happier and healthier.
And this cross-fertilization between many different lineages of work is something I always mention and emphasize within the broader permaculture movement, where inevitably with movements there can be a degree of self-referencing, and it's always my objective to point to other parallel lineages of work that synergize all of these different ideas coming simultaneously from many different sources and in many different local, cultural and economic contexts.
But see, this, I love hearing you say that, because this is for me what the localization movement is about, is that by labeling things and describing this systemic shift towards local, we're describing a shift towards this utter and total respect for diversity, the diversity of ecosystems, of climates, of cultures, and labeling it local means everybody owns it in their own local place, in their own local context. And one of the things I would say is that early on there was a little bit of a tendency among even maybe Bill himself and some of the young students in permaculture were tending a little too much to come in with a predefined formula, an Australian formula, which sometimes meant also Australian species of plants. And I wonder what you have to say about that.
Yes, well, it's been one of the issues of constantly in permaculture teaching for me, that the ethics of care of the earth, care of people and fair share, and the design principles however they are articulated, are the fundamental and what we believe universal parts of permaculture. But the strategies and techniques and the design solutions are always dependent on the context. And the context includes the biology, the culture, the people, the history, the connection to place. And so in that sense, that's a counterflow to the globalized sort of pre-assumption that there's one pattern or one solution to any particular issue that can be templated across if not across the world, then across large scales. And that is a problem for the sort of capitalist, globalist mindset that wants to do things large and fast, that it's messy. And that's one of the reasons that actually agriculture was one of the last activities on the planet to be industrialized, because it's very messy and particular, and this soil is different. Whereas if you look at something like textile manufacture, that was actually the first process to be industrialized, and it's sort of half suited the industrialization process. So the gains, whether those gains were distributed or not is another matter, but those gains in productivity were greatest in those earliest stages of industrialization, whereas the last things to be industrialized have been the least gains and the most disasters, because they're so situation and site specific. So it conflicts with the global paradigm, and everything needs to evolve in its own context.
Yeah, but I would slightly differ on that, because I would say that what precedes industrialization was the power grabbing that happened through enclosures and slavery. And then as people were driven off the land and off their own land, producing a diversity of products for themselves, they were driven onto those, for instance, those cotton monocultures that then later on lent themselves to industrial production. But it was the precursor to the industrial.
Yeah, that's very true, that you couldn't actually get the feedstock for those efficient spinning devices without the initial destruction. And
see, that's also why for me now it's very important that we really clearly spell out that endemic to the modern economy is monoculture, starting with those roots in slavery and enclosures, literally forcing people off the land, forcing them away from diversified, more self-reliant, by the way, I prefer to say community reliant.
Yeah, self and collective reliant.
It was generally, it was never really self. It was always community. And so it's this community reliance on each other and on the land in diversified production with diverse skills that developed. People were multiple, they weren't this sort of single function reduced to, I'm an editor, I'm a singer, I'm a builder. It was, people had multiple skills and they were producing multiple things for their needs. And so the foundation then in modernity is a formula of monoculture, which means it's anti-life. A fundamental principle of life is diversity. And it's, to me, what's interesting now is I see permaculture as being very, in a way, emblematic for diversified production. And what I love now, what's happening, is that I see a sort of marriage between permaculture as mainly a homesteading process into a marriage with farming. And so I know lots of examples now where farmers who also maybe have organic or biodynamic experience and practices marrying with permaculture into farms, 50 acres, even a few hundred acres. And that for me is a very, very important step. And I wonder, how would you describe the way permaculture has changed in your almost 40 years of experience with it?
Well, the influence in agriculture, especially in countries like Australia, has been limited because of the ruthless economics which have sort of governed that structure. But the examples that you were referring to often illustrate where people are using organic and biodynamic methods of husbandry and using permaculture as a design framework for how that, in a spatial layout sense and an organisation and relation to markets and communities, work, that permaculture's been able to contribute at that physical spatial design and sequential development, site development, and at the organisational, more social side. And I suppose that reflects a growth in what a lot of people would call is social permaculture. Now just call it applying permaculture design thinking in the social context.
Yeah.
But that emergence from also permanent or enduring agriculture to permanent and enduring culture.
So earlier on, you were talking about the productivity that was gained through industrial agriculture. And this is something that we very much dispute. In other words, we are arguing that you take any 2 bits of land of any size, you will always be able to produce more through diversity. You will never, in any context, any climate, be able to be more productive with monoculture. So the great productivity of fossil fuel, toxic, job-destroying chemical agriculture was to destroy jobs. So this was the efficiency. We removed people from the land, replaced them with machines, fossil fuels, and lots of pollution, while unemployment was created. And this is something that we are witnessing right now as our ongoing work in the Global South continues, that this process is continuing, and as it drives people away from the land into big cities in desperate search of employment, it creates fundamentalist, divisive, and often violent conflict and fundamentalism. So I think it's really important that we question this entire mode of agriculture from the outset.
Yeah, I mean, I think I completely agree with almost everything you've said. I suppose I was saying about the productivity of the industrial process of machines spinning fibre relative to people doing it by hand. When isolated, that process, of course, there were all sorts of other terrible downsides about that, but that situation where people had very limited clothing that lasted them for a long time, to a world where, for at least people of even modest means, clothing has become so ubiquitous that people almost just take it for granted. Now, of course, the means of production that have created that have so many downsides and destructive processes. But when we compare that industrial process compared with actually going back and on any piece of land trying to actually industrialize agriculture, and especially food production, as the industrial process came back into Europe, especially in the 20th century, any claimed productivity gains were actually tiny or non-existent when properly evaluated. Yeah. So that's where I would agree that the shift from complex mixed farms in the European landscape to the industrial forms, the productivity gains were mostly by how much produce could be effectively marketed into the monetarized economies, and that then discarded a lot of the non-monetary or localized, if you like, marginal products and extra diverse yields that were consumed within the farm economy and the local economy, because the centralised market system can't actually effectively access that production.
Yeah.
So the shift to monoculture creates more product that can be effectively centralised, which benefits, of course, the largest operators and the corporations and governments,
Yeah.
but disadvantages the local economies.
Yeah,
So
I think we have to say it disadvantages the majority of people, and so in creating a structure that benefits large traders and large corporations, what we've also created is a structure that widens the gap between rich and poor steadily. And as these monocultures grow bigger and bigger, so do the profits to fewer and fewer people, and the marginalization of larger and larger numbers of people. So I think what's really important is I think that we agree that smaller, more diversified production is essential when it comes to our interaction with nature, you know, whether it's farming, whether it's fishery or forestry. We need to be encouraging that diversified production. And I also would argue that we need to be encouraging technologies that are in the hands of people. In other words, there are many tools and technologies that can be very helpful, but it's when these technologies become vast systems that are linked to this widening gap between rich and poor and extracting profit for the few at the expense of the many.
Well, that's where I'd completely agree, and that's part of the reason for my passion about biomass energy, even though in conventional Australian affluent environmental thinking, the idea of burning trees for energy is either seen as primitive, polluting, or no, that will allow corporations to hoover up all of our forests and feed them into retrofitted coal-fired power stations. And yes, those fears are real, but also if we harvest the sustainable abundance of biomass that grows, and woody biomass grows much more easily than food biomass. Anyone who has worked land knows that trees and wood and grass grow much more easily than something we can eat. So how to use that, the technology involved, even quite sophisticated technology to do that, and through combined heat and power systems, can be manufactured in local engineering workshops, localized, whereas clean room manufacturing to produce photovoltaic panels and so many of the very complex renewable energies are actually, yes, they can be done at that smaller, more localized scale, but the complexity makes them just easier to be taken into the largest centralized system, so we then have dependence on that.
Yeah.
So it's not like that we should, yes, have all biomass energy instead of photovoltaic panels, but that missing link of small-scale dispatchable energy produced locally as part of sensible management of our forests and environment, and that technology, even if some of the bits of it we might buy from the best producers that might happen to be a co-op of engineers in Berkeley, California, for example, that we've done some research and said, gee, that what they're doing is very interesting in that field. But we know that technology could be made in a local engineering workshop.
Absolutely.
So that's the sort of technology that we primarily favour, that because of that ability to be manufactured locally, and that is also then a hedge against a more radical energy descent future where the more complex things are, the less likely we will have any ability for our descendants to be able to make them.
Absolutely. I mean, this is all about recognizing that we must localize and decentralize. And I completely agree with you about this. Also, even biodiesel friend of ours on a Japanese farm with only 5 acres. He's creating enough biodiesel to run his machinery on his farm. And certainly in terms of burning wood for heating and so on at various levels, it's an excellent idea. And I actually question this argument that wood smoke is so dangerous for our health. I think anyone who will smell, you know, the odor that comes off a wood fire compared to the smell from a diesel generator, our bodies know that the wood smoke is not so bad for us. Of course it could be excessive, but I started questioning this when working in the Himalayas and seeing all these experts funded by big business. As it happens in this instance, it was Tata Energy Research. They sell, you know, lots of trucks and cars, and they were coming, you know, doing research about the dangerous effect of these wood and dung-fueled stoves, all kinds of research about this. I never once saw a researcher come to the Himalayas concerned about the impact of all these trucks and cars and the fumes that were now affecting people's health. Not a single study about the danger of that. So we have to be quite alert and awake now to figuring out what is, you know, what is healthy. And also if we look at what have we been doing for thousands of years in our history, and how much has cancer increased in the modern era compared to the earlier era. This may be too controversial.
Well, it is actually very interesting if we step back from that issue and look at the huge interest there is in Australia and in California and many other countries of the resurgence of interest in cultural burning as a land management tool done by Indigenous people, and in the Australian Pyrocene future, there's huge numbers of people also hoping that this rekindling of this cultural knowledge of using small, cool fire in the landscape will actually save us in some ways. Now, I have a very nuanced sort of view about all of that, but one of the things I see very closely, and I see this very closely with what Indigenous people are saying, is this fire is a part of not just our culture and management of the land, that all our ancestors sat around fire, all our ancestors used fire, and this alienation of modern people from fire in that most basic sense. And then of course it leads to dysfunction, that kids can't even have a fire without getting themselves burnt, or maybe, you know, the threat that it's going to burn down something, so that then leads to this feedback of, oh no, we need to remove ourselves from any connection to fire because it's dangerous. Whereas the Indigenous message is, no, we need to re-familiarise, and not just in that, how do we safely burn landscape for ecological benefit, but how do we live with fire?
So one thing we also have to think about is, in whose hands is this going on? The burning and almost everything that's happening now is the threat of giant corporations abusing these things. And that's happening also with the burning. So in Australia, Qantas is coming in and burning thousands of acres of land in a completely destructive way, and using the Aboriginal fire management as the argument for it. So we've got to be really, really careful. And
well, it's interesting, you know, if you look at cultural burning, and I don't want to reduce it to this, because there is a huge, deep connection to culture and meaning that underpin these systems. But if we simplify it down to logistics, it's cool, small-scale, labour-intensive burning. And that's what our economy just is a complete anathema to it.
Exactly.
It's situation-specific. It's not amenable to formula, large-scale replication. And
And we need to say that about the growing of food, about the tending to animals.
Yeah.
This is exactly what it's about. If we want to move forward into a healthier planet and healthier people, that's precisely what we need. And that's what localization is about. The globalizing path has been that path of distance, imposition of large-scale practices, monocultural, deadly for people, deadly for the planet. What I feel very encouraged by is that I see everywhere on every continent, from the bottom up, this will of people without support, without help from government, without help from the media, beginning to turn towards that more reconnected, highly sophisticated path, which is that attention to the specifics, to the diverse, and where you need human intelligence. And you know, one thing I'm so aware of now is that there's huge propaganda for robots right now. There's this sort of real propaganda that says that human beings are innately greedy and aggressive, and look what they've done. They made such a mess of the planet. Let's hope that the robots will do a better job. I even see discussions about them being kinder and wiser than human beings.
Yeah.
You know, we have to keep in mind that they come from these mega industrial processes, from mega corporations that have invested billions, if not trillions of dollars into these technologies. We know that just because of the very nature of that market, as you identified earlier, a market that cannot deal with the complexities that the localized systems can and do, they eliminate and flatten. So when you talk about creativity as a tool, they emanate from a mega system that is not going to be able...
I'm naive, but I look at those things and I think they are laughably vulnerable to the realities of actually working in the world.
Yeah.
Now, clearly they work within the constrained confines of robotic manufacturing and whatever these constrained environments. But the idiocies we already see of dysfunction from roboticized people within bureaucracies where the intelligence of the person and the capabilities and goodwill of that worker to say not only just is what is in my interest, what is in the interests of the customers or the people we're dealing with, but even to embody the interest of the organisation that they're supposed to be employed by is completely ignored and downsized, and they're put in this robotic structure which produces dysfunction.
Yeah.
So that in an attempt to replace them with more actual robots, to me is just like driving so many of those systems over the cliff. Now, maybe that's into further iterations of disaster capitalism.
Yeah.
But I see a lot of these things, although they may have very adverse downsides, I also see that mostly they are illusory dreams that will
fade away.
Will hit so many brick walls that they actually won't generate what they produce.
Yeah.
Now, I said the same thing about genetically engineered food, and you could say decades later, yes, the downsides of this, we would all agree, have been immense. But when looked at in terms of the claims they made back in the 80s, how we would have nitrogen-fixing wheat that would triple productivity, all of those things have been a complete failure. They've been complete duds.
Yeah.
So although they've managed to market and force these things, the fact that they're actually defective products has meant that they haven't made the transformative impact that all the promoters hoped, because they're actually dud technology. So part of my discourse in these things is not to give too much credit to this all-powerful evil forces, but to laugh at their stupid designs.
Well, I love that. That is exactly. We need to laugh at the stupid foundations of the modern economy, and it's the economy together with these technologies which are laughable. To have a measure as GDP, as you know, which just measures commercialization, which means in many cases measuring breakdown as progress. It is laughable. I totally agree, and I also agree that in every aspect these technologies cannot work, but that's also true of the pesticides and the chemical fertilizers. They've destroyed the soil. They've made it more and more difficult to produce food. Nevertheless, until we have more wake up and more resistance, they're still, increasing the amount of these chemicals. And then also now with the help of genetic modification. So it's not at all that these things can work, because they absolutely can't work in the long run. It's more a question of, over the next 10 years or so, how much of society will be further damaged by this idiocy, that is laughable, and now reinforced by robots and algorithms. And I think the algorithm and the robot is the same thing, but in the financial markets also, to allow this, again, laughable creation of wealth that isn't wealth at all. It's simply allowing a power elite to decide the value of our currency, the value of our food, the value of our democracy in this amazingly, just crazy system. So much of it is about people, ordinary people, waking up to why the unemployment, why the time pressures, why the ill health, the violence, the climate change. All these are symptoms of a laughable system.
I'll give you an example of one of the ways that I've attempted to pull the rug out from under some of those systems through my retro-suburbia work, that I've argued this revitalisation of the household and community non-monetary economies in affluent countries to take back activity which has been shunted into the monetary economy over our lifetimes. So, partly as a challenge to academics to actually properly study this, I've suggested that half the growth in GDP in my lifetime has been completely fake. Now, not in the sense that you mentioned before, that it's actually like more legal litigation or car accidents, more bads and disservices, but in a more simple sense, when people stopped taking their lunch from home and bought their lunch at work, no more lunches were created, but the process became monetarised. So this shunting of huge amounts of activity that even in the affluent, highly urbanised countries like Australia, when we were young, there was a huge amount of this activity still happened in homes and in the communities without monetary transaction. That transfer, without actually creating more actual material or value economic transition or product or value for people in real time, has grown GDP. So, if it's better for society, better for the environment, better for individuals to pull at least some of that activity back into the household and community non-monetary economies, then we can do it and call it growth. And so therefore, I am pro-growth.
I love that, David. That I am also pro-growth for exactly that reason. I'm pro more jobs, more businesses also. So even not just a transfer into the non-monetarized, the shift away from one giant corporation to sometimes millions of enterprises around the world, that's at another level, where we could have a growth in the number and we could have a growth in genuine wealth creation. Again, we want to use land to produce more. We want to see real growth there. And while doing that, it's also producing more meaningful and enjoyable jobs.
Yes, well, I believe one of the prime pathways how that happens is the system restarts at the kindergarten level. The household and community non-monetary economies are the nursery or breeding ground for rebuilding the monetary economy in a holistic, organic, natural way. Now, it would be great if we could break up so many of these corporate structures and redevelop them as co-ops and small businesses, but my observation through time is we don't see so many of those processes historically, but when those systems break, people rebuild economic functionality from the bottom, and that often is in that nursery of the household and community gift and non-monetary economies. But then out of that comes the people who are really passionate about something, really good about something, that find this is their life's work, their passion, their livelihood. So I completely agree we need reformed monetary economies, that not everything is appropriate to do at the household level. But that's been, I think, one of the pathways that I have, focused more on. Not that should be to the exclusion of the important small-scale, locally owned and cooperative businesses.
Yeah. I think that's interesting. I think there's also an area where there's a sort of, we're coming to the same end but from different angles, because what I've seen is that by emphasizing this localization process, and we've been able to get people even in big cities to connect with the farmers in the city around them. And what's been fascinating and very encouraging is that they've been able to do that using the national currency. Now, as I was saying earlier, the national currency is under constant speculation, the value is being manipulated, our leaders are artificially, agreeing to lower the value of their currency in order to be able to export more. Despite all of those shenanigans at the top, what's been happening from the bottom up is that people have been able to creatively use the national currency to build these real structures of interdependence, and that are these more localized systems, and that are real lifeboats. Now, in the meanwhile, as I see it, permaculture has more been starting with the household level and the non-monetized economy, the informal, and the two are very badly, needed together, and they support each other. But what's been really interesting is the fact that using the national currency has actually worked better than trying to encourage a barter economy, a gift economy, or local currencies.
Right.
Because we actually started several, some of them ran for 10 years even. A friend of mine who's the mayor of Bristol, he brought in a local currency there, and his salary was paid in that, and people could even pay the local council taxes with that Bristol pound, but it's still not taken off. Now, in my mind, therefore, what's more important is to keep working within the, as I say, using the dominant currency, but the key thing is to establish these relationships and to support the small, the local, and to just grow that as much as we can in the informal economy, but also outside, and not become too idealistic. Like I say, sometimes when people hear about local and so they want to jump immediately to gift economy, but we found again and again that it's not working. And what is so wonderful is that we are able to support small farmers and growers, small-scale manufacturing, processing, and building up these relationships, which ultimately, hopefully, we will be looking at decentralized currencies. But that's going to be a long way, well, I don't know about a long way off, but it's a more distant goal.
I agree completely about the limitations of gift economy, but also work with friends who've continued to push and be the guinea pig in their own transformation into more and more of their activity being in the gift economy. So I think all of these experiments and the learning from them and learning what has worked
Yeah.
where, and I think, and I agree with you that a lot of the efforts to create regional and local currencies have, have worked for various periods of time and then failed.
But you see, also what I find so interesting is that the people who are actually dealing more in the real economy, and again, that's the wood and the food and the water and the soil, that those efforts where people are actually getting involved with that, whether it be in the informal economy at home or in the local food movement, where we are using the currency through the various forms of community-supported agriculture, farmers markets, co-ops, and so on. But again, those are the initiatives that I see as all around the world steadily growing, and that's what I'm so happy and grateful for, because that's a real transformation that is so meaningful. And that's why I think it's also quite important then, when people become interested, to encourage them in a direction that we know is more of a winner, rather than, some people are upset when I say, oh, I can't recommend starting with a local currency, but I can't bear the idea of people working hard, getting exhausted, and then after some years finding that it was a failure. I feel right now we've got to be looking very carefully at, as you say, studying what's going on and seeing where there is more traction.
If people get organised, they find they can provide their needs in ways without participating in those systems. And yes, we still have, the national currency, and we are still exchanging that, but it's with a person, another small business. So I make a demarcation in thinking about this, both also in terms of regulation, that we can think at one end, the household and community non-monetary economies regulated by gift and reciprocity, and then individual self-employed people and small business where the workers in that small business are working in some direct reciprocity with their boss. That's another category. And then we have big businesses that are big to the point where the boss never meets many of the people who are employed, but it's still controlled by a natural person, a human. It's actually a human-owned company. And then there's the corporations, which are profit maximising, cost minimising machines that they need a completely different set of regulations. And so we should see all regulatory activity in terms of those hierarchies. And obviously there's some grey areas in the crossover, but we can actually define the line of the corporation, the non-natural person, because it's legally a defined entity. We can actually put a regulation line. If you're on that side of that line, then you need to comply with these regulations.
And of course what's happening is exactly the opposite, which is that those machine-like structures, not run by humans, some quite nice humans inside them, they are now setting the rules for society. They are now giving the rules to our government, and leading to massive over-regulation of the smaller businesses and the non-monetary sector, which is being, we're paying taxes for local councils to come into our house and tell us how big the steps have to be in our house and how high the windows are allowed to be. And, this is one of the areas we've been trying to raise awareness about for a long time, is that most people, self-respecting, conservative capitalist, would not go along with a system where giant global monopolies are actually being able to get subsidies from our government for the infrastructure. They're not taxed, and then in the meanwhile you have this over-regulation, which they also wouldn't approve of. But I think it's precisely the confusion
between those different levels.
And it's particularly, like you say, the machine-like structure of the corporation, which is also by nature globally active, versus more place-based, accountable, human.
Well, this is one of the opportunities to have a synergy of coming together of political views that might be on the left, social justice, green side, which has often favoured regulation to control the bad effects of that. And on the other side, the socially conservative, small business, more libertarian view that of people feeling in a straitjacket of gathering red tape, and that both of those valid views can come together.
Exactly. Exactly. It's so good and important. I'm so glad you're saying that, because it is really such an important conversation. I really hope people are listening to this, because not enough people are saying this. And what I've seen is that even in Sweden, these small business owners, farmers, those types of conservatives with a small c, are being pushed into ultra conservatism, fear, prejudice, even, voting for demagogues that are, virtually taking us towards fascism. And it's because there's such a lack of awareness. They feel so constrained by these, what they only see as government regulations. They're being crushed. So I so hope we can get this message out.
Well, I think it's part of building coalitions, actually not across the centre of society and its norms, but actually at the various fringes. And this came up in the local bushfire convergence, which has just happened, that the recognition that the Indigenous mob, the battler sort of small rural farmers and the environmentalist people on the front line of working with nature, maybe through permaculture frameworks, that those three fringe groups of society in relation to the fire threat land management issue actually have a lot of potential commonalities, and that if an alliance between those apparently disparate groups that can come together and then start to influence what the more central mainstream does, because it's actually a unified message from what are apparently very different ideological or interest groups, but they actually on the ground have huge commonalities.
And this is also why, from our point of view, starting by building those relationships at the local level, in local communities, is what creates such a strong foundation, and that then those community groups can link up with others to form that broader platform, and ultimately insist on policy change, insist on regulatory change. But I think the just that message that the environmental movement really can no longer afford to ignore. Well, when we're talking about the regulations, we are basically talking about the economic system. And because it's the economic system that's leading to this regulatory madness, in other words, the deregulation of global trade and global finance, is fundamental to what's happened, and the power and strength of those global deregulated corporations and banks shaping and very often bringing in policies at the national level to destroy what they see as their competitors, these tiny businesses. It's unbelievable. So I think really now it's absolutely essential that we put out the word that we need a holistic approach. It's what I call big picture activism. We can no longer afford silo thinking. And, permaculture started with this holistic view, and that needs to be applied across the board. And, because what you're saying too, that these supposedly even extreme conservatives and left green people actually have so much in common, because we all want to have a healthy, sane society and some kind of community fabric. Of course we want a healthy environment. Of course no one wants to drink water that's poisoned or full of chemicals. No one wants to eat food that is no longer nutrition but just a product, coming from bullies, as you say, moles and bullies in Australia. We have to explain that that's the
That's
name
supposed
that
to.
the supermarkets in Australia are called Coles and Woolies. So David is talking about them as moles and
And of course,
bullies.
there's a
Yeah,
greater monopoly of the food distribution system, I think, in
yeah,
Australia than any other country in
yeah,
the world. So we are
yeah,
quite an extreme case of
yeah,
that
yeah,
universal
yeah.
pattern around the world.
You know, it's so interesting too for me to see that part of the concentration is linked to farms that are bigger than anywhere else in the world. You know, you've got 25,000 acres of just sheep, and you never really had, you know, a tradition of smaller, diversified farms. And yet, out of Australia comes permaculture, which is about small scale, diversified systems. And I actually think it's not by chance in a way, because I also find in America a very strong and clear resistance to this corporate monoculture, both in social and environmental terms, and probably because there too the extremes were much clearer. Whereas in
Experienced
Europe,
the worst
they
of those
experienced the worst.
systems, yeah.
Whereas in Europe, you know, especially in places like Scandinavia, we had relatively benign governments, and we had, you know, it was a relatively gentle takeover of the land, and, you
And I
know,
think
shoving
also
people into high-rise apartments.
the social and cultural conservatism of more traditional rural communities in Europe meant that people were just a little bit more questioning about ideas like get big or get out,
Yeah,
and you know, continued with their ways and didn't necessarily respond to both the carrots and the sticks
yeah,
as much as in the new Europes of North America and Australia,
yeah,
where the processes of disconnection from land, certainly in this
yeah,
country, you know, the effect of the global depression of the 1890s was savage in
yeah,
Australia in breaking the beginnings of seeding of small local economies, and then the number of men proportional to population that we lost in the First World War. So those beginnings of a sort of a connected culture of place within the context of of course, colonisation and dispossession of Indigenous people, those elements were you know, destroyed early on, and so those consequences we've had to push back harder and reinvent those things more consciously rather than just relying on culture and tradition to hold their own and you know, over greater
yeah.
periods of time.
But also there, what we have to keep in mind, what's very worrying, is that the globalization of media has been so extreme. And so I'm very aware that, you know, in Scandinavia, you know, as I was growing up, there was no advertising on television. All that stuff wasn't. But again, it was this liberalization of trade that allowed these American giants to start beaming in their advertising, their violence, and it had a clear cultural effect. From my point of view, as someone who was moving between countries and observing these changes, that most people who only been in place are often more vulnerable to the machinations of the dominant system, and, you know, haven't seen so clearly these changes. But, you know, that also leads me back to one thing earlier we were talking about, which was these bigger picture waves of change, you know, and with the energy question and so on. And I just wanted to say that in my experience, Rachel Carson, you know, was one of the main voices that helped to launch an environmental movement. And, you know, she, as an influential scientist, was able to reach the entire world because the media was not yet so colonized. And her message was very clear, and that is we need a change to science to become more holistic. We, in this narrow, reductionist silo thinking, we believe that we can just put a little bit of poison over here and that will just affect that little bit of land there, but it has an effect on the web of life. So we have to understand this interconnected web of life. We have to proceed more cautiously. that message came out very strongly at the same time that everyone who had woken up to the deadliness of this fossil fuel-based urbanized existence, they were demanding a back to the land movement, decentralization. We want to go back to nature. You know, that
And
was
we're
the
talking about
60s.
1960,
In the
62,
60s.
really.
Yeah,
It was Rachel
yeah,
Carson's
yeah, yeah.
work published.
So we're talking
Yes.
about the 60s and the movement that arose, you know, particularly in America and I think throughout the industrialized world. So these two together, the more holistic thinking, the decentralization, now that was the demand, and it actually led to some changes at universities. I was connected to some in Sweden, in Germany, and in America. I taught at one at the University of Berkeley. There was also such a strong demand for decentralized renewable energy that the US government actually funded a bureau headed by someone named Dennis Hayes, whom I knew, for solar energy.
Yep.
But what I witnessed personally was that by the 80s, as the corporate world was becoming aware of the seriousness of the environmental crisis, the pollution caused by this fossil fuel-based chemical agriculture and so on, I saw how as they became concerned and they started getting involved in the movement, it started to shift the discussion away from decentralization or localization, and very much supported by holistic interdisciplinary knowledge, towards continuing the narrow focus, compartmentalization. I knew Maurice Strong personally. Maurice Strong is the man who organized that big meeting in Rio in '92, and he had organized an earlier one in Stockholm.
Yeah, the
His
72.
wife was Danish, and she had become very deeply involved in the environmental movement, also in more spiritual, indigenous tradition. She really influenced him. And I also perhaps had a bit of influence, but he, as he became more concerned, you know, a genuine concern, went off to talk to the Aspen Institute, to corporate heads, to someone named Karl-Heinz Schmidt-Heine, who was the head of a giant conglomerate in Switzerland, got funding for Rio from these giant corporations, and essentially set the stage for the destruction of the environmental movement. And not through ill will. I'm absolutely convinced. And I've seen so many of my colleagues in the environmental movement. I knew all of them in Europe and North America. In the 70s, 80s, 90s, I was, you know, traveling and giving talks in all, you know, so many different countries. And also in Korea and Japan later. And what I saw was that almost everyone who becomes aware feels that we need to talk to the powerful. We need to talk to the corporation. We need to talk to government. And very early on, it became clear to me that, well, maybe not so early on, at some point by the 90s, it was pretty clear to me that no, let's talk to each other. Let's really talk to each other about maintaining that holistic perspective, being clear about what we want, being clear about what's going wrong also. And I do think we need both. The meeting in Rio, many people will still describe as the high point of the environmental movement. I see it as the nadir.
Oh, well, I do too. It's the
I love you.
it's the end of what I call the second wave, in the
Yeah.
same way that in the Australian context, 1983 and the election of the Hawke Keating government was the end of that 70s wave, even though it was an election where the main election issue was an environmental issue, whether the southwest wilderness of Tasmania was going to be flooded, and that election, national election, was fought over that issue. And environmentalists thought this is the dawning of the new age. And as I said, we got the Thatcherite Reaganite revolution, which was sort of building earlier than that. We got it with a human face, I would say, with the Hawke Keating government, but it was the deregulation of the banks and the greed is good culture, and it was the end of that, and yet environmentalists thought that that was, yes, finally,
Yeah.
this has arrived.
Yeah.
But, you know, these waves are building stronger and stronger,
Yeah.
I believe.
Yeah.
And I think,
Yeah.
you know, the GFC globally and now the pandemic is building these waves of bottom-up realisation and change faster and faster. Now, I don't think it necessarily means that there's an overwhelm and suddenly, you know, the reformed utopian world arrives out of that. But for example, some of my more modest objectives in this space of talking to people about what they do in their home space, how that fits into a larger picture. The essay I wrote, Feeding Retro-Suburbia from the Backyard to the Bioregion, I talk about within 20 years a localised bioregional food system around a city like Melbourne of 5 million people could be feeding 20% of the population from a combination of garden farming, urban farming and bioregional food supply, while I fully expect that the governments will still use taxpayers' funds to keep stabilising and reinforcing the centralised food delivery production system. I think World Localization Day is encapsulating so many of the cluster of positive responses to the manifold crises we're facing come under that rubric. And of course, in all that complexity and diversity, that concept of localised activity, farming, living, economic exchange, culture, re-emergent localised culture, and the hybrids that will be possible in each different place. I think that's a framework that draws together so many of the things that we need to do. I think that positive future definitely needs to be informed by those understandings that are held of what is the history and learnings of all these decades of struggle for these, because I think that's one of the things that some of us elders, and now include myself in that world of that perspective of history, to understand those larger processes. And yes, I agree completely. It is not about evil people, but about malfunctioning and inappropriate structures.
Yeah. Thank you. Many thanks, David. I so appreciate it, and I look forward to many more years of collaboration.
Thank you, and it's been great to be here for this more intimate, friendly discussion about these issues.
Thank you.